As indicated previously, the imperial economies of Spain and Portugal in the New World were essentially based on extractive industries, the extraction of precious metals or sugar and their marketing in Europe. But this begs a question. Was this form of economic exploitation a fundamental feature of the physical ecology and physical geography of the region? Or does it rather reflect the peculiarities of Spanish and Portuguese society? There is no simple answer to this question, and in fact there are competing approaches to the problem. First, consider the argument of geographic determinism. If one looks at South America and the Caribbean, the areas settled by the Spanish and the Portuguese, what we notice is that these are hot, wet, muggy territories. They are, from the European point of view, uncomfortable, as illustrated here in this photograph of Humphrey Bogart making his way through a swamp. They are often infested with diseases that were not necessarily native to the New World, but may have been brought by European settlers, diseases such as malaria and yellow fever. And they were notably unsuitable for European crops. European crops could be easily transported into temperate zones of the world, but in the Amazon River Basin and the Caribbean, the soils are thin, acidic, and susceptible to slash and burn agriculture for short periods of time, but not suitable for the type of crops that dominated European agriculture. As a consequence, from this point of view, as the Portuguese and Spanish moved into the Caribbean and the Amazon River region, they were drawn only to the highlands, areas that the Native Americans had already discovered were most suitable for dense population and agriculture. Consider, for example, these terraced hills of what were once the heartland of the Inca Empire. And remember that in settling these areas, the Europeans came on dense populations in well-organized imperial systems in which they could replace the leadership and use the organization to exploit the labor force for the extraction of precious metals. Similar circumstances faced the Portuguese when they arrived on the coast of Brazil. Again, a hot, wet, disease-infected area unsuitable for European crops, but quite suitable for the growing of sugarcane and the exploitation of labor to that end. So from one point of view, you could say that whoever occupied this territory, whatever part of Europe they came from, the result would have been the same, that it was physical geography that dictated the outcome. There is, however, another point of view, another argument that goes to the nature of Iberian society. This painting by El Greco of Don Rodrigo, executed in the early 17th century, reminds us that Iberian society at this time was dominated by a hereditary aristocratic elite and clerical elite that derived their income from rents and tithes. The great novelist Cervantes, in his novel Don Quixote, again of the early 17th century, pokes fun at this feudal society that made its way jousting about the Iberian Peninsula and extracting its wealth from the production of peasants. In contrast was the society growing up at the same time in Northern Europe, as illustrated in this painting of the Anatomy Lesson by Rembrandt, also executed in the early 17th century, this time in Amsterdam, and showing the emerging bourgeoisie, or commercial and professional classes of Amsterdam and the other major cities of Northern Europe. Note how these men are focused on not the frivolities of their starched collars, as in the portrait of Don Rodrigo, but rather focusing on the anatomy lesson here delivered by Dr. Tulip, a kind of demonstration of interest in scientific and technical advances that were characteristic of the Low Countries at this time. And consider that when the Dutch made it to the New World, they established not plantations or mines, but rather commercial and industrial centers like New Amsterdam, pictured here in the middle of the 17th century. It is therefore not surprising that whereas the Portuguese led in the extraction of raw sugar from the New World, the shipping, financing, insurance, and marketing of the sugar was controlled increasingly by the Dutch and later English merchants who were at the advancing edge of a commercial revolution in Northern Europe. From this point of view, one might be able to say that it was the peculiarities of Iberian society that shaped the character of the imperial economies. But this is a question, not an answer, and this debate over physical geography or social structure as the dominant factor in the evolution of these events remains unresolved.